Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma daf Nun. Today's daf is sponsored by Shira and Dori Dishon in loving memory of their son, Eitan Dishon, who heroically fought in Gaza. He loved learning Torah and encouraged his father to learn daf Yomi with him. We will be'ezrat Hashem complete that for him. Okay, with that, we are going to get started now. We're going to review from the Mishna at the bottom of Mem Tet Amud Bet. So we're starting Dinei Bor, and now we're going to get into all these machlokot. So this is a good example of where I said we mentioned things here and there, and they're sometimes a little bit confusing. Now we're kind of going to make order out of Bor and the different approaches. There's a bunch of different really basic machlokot about Bor that we're going to discuss today. So the Mishnah had given 3 cases, and it's a little bit confusing because what they're discussing is not a typical Bor, which you would have hoped they would have discussed, but instead they're discussing a Bor that starts in one place and kind of opens somewhere else. Okay, the best example, unfortunately, now we have that we can visualize are the tunnels, right? If you think about the tunnels, so the tunnels go under the ground in one area, and then they open in a different area, right? If you think about those Kamma's tunnels, so, that's exactly this case of Hofir Bor Bereshit Yachid, or the reverse, right? They're dug up under the ground in a private domain. So under the ground, most of it, and the truth is some of the Mefarshim say what we're talking about is the depth. Remember, we do need a depth of 10 tefachim to be liable for death, so which we'll get to at the end of today's daf, but the depth is really in a different domain. But the exit, the petach, the opening, entrance, exit, however you call it, is in Rishut Rabbi. Now, for our purposes, it's not going to really matter at the end. Now, the commentaries say, let's say there aren't 10 tefachim deep in the public domain, where it opens, the opening doesn't go so deep down. But eventually, right, the depth of the bore where underground it is 10 tefachim deep. So now the main point here, though, is this is called a bore in the public domain because it opens in the public domain, and that's where people fall in, right? The fact that it's underground in a private domain is irrelevant, really, for the purposes of bore, because someone could fall in from the public domain. Or the reverse. Okay, where it opens in a private domain, even though it's actually underground in the public domain. Or or it's in one private domain and it opens in a different private domain. Some people say it's the same person's private domain, but 2 different domains. I'm not going to go into that whole thing right now. But chaya, all 3 cases are going to be chaya, which poses a problem to the Gemara because this either a bor, and we're going to see in a minute, according to Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, either bor is a public domain bor. Basically, I created an obstacle in the Rishut Rabim, or we say it's a private domain. Now, when we talk about private domain, it can't be the case where you walked into my yard and I happen to have a pool and you fall into my pool. Now, it happens in legal cases, okay? In the law, if you have a pool, you have to have a gate around it to protect, right? There has to be a fence around your pool to make sure that people don't fall in. But according to halacha, if you trespassed on my property and fell into my pool and drowned, okay, let's just assume pool is a bore. Okay, we're not going to talk about all the dimensions and what kills about bore. We'll get to that later. Maybe pool isn't actually a halachic bore, but let's just use it as an example because we don't really have cisterns in our backyards these days. So it's a little easier to talk about a case of someone who has a pool in their backyard. Now, if you have a pool in your property, you're not going to be liable. However, and I'll give a good example from my house. Try to describe this. Imagine 2 parallel streets. Now, the street where I live goes in. It's like a U-shaped street. So the people, where I live, on the inside of the U, are actually very close to the parallel street. Much closer than if, you have to walk around. It would take me like 5 or 8 minutes to get all the way around the block to a place where if I just cut through the house across the street from me, I'm already at the nearby street. Okay, so my across the street neighbor, because I'm at the bottom of the U, across the street I have a neighbor whose face is right opposite me. In their backyard, there's a gate. That gate leads to a park that's on the street nearby. And my son used to go to Gun, right, like near there, and we used to cut through their house. Okay, and it's changed owners, and not all the owners allow people to walk through their property because, right, it ruins their grass, it ruins their right. People traipse through. But at the time, a friend of mine was living there and she let us go through. Now there's a gate, and there was a lock on it. So we take the lock off and, go through. Let's say she makes that public and opens the gate. The gate's always open. everyone could always walk through their garden. And what if they had a pool or a cistern or something there, or something that caused people damage? Could they sue and say, hey, you made your, now, this is exactly the case that we're going to see Rabbi Akiva talks about. It's in a private domain. Hifkir reshuto v'lo hifkir boro. They said, oh, people want to pass by, go for it. This will save people lots of time. We'll allow our backyard to be a public thoroughfare. It's not exactly a public thoroughfare, but we're going to allow anyone who wants to come through can come straight through. What happens, but they didn't say our pool is no longer our pool, or our cistern is no longer only our cistern, it's everybody's. No, they just allowed people to walk through their street, their property. That's the case that Rabbi Akiva says you're chayav. Okay, so I might say, what do you mean? It's right. I was doing something, my friend was doing something nice. She was letting people come, but now she's going to have to assume responsibility for any damages that happen. You can imagine now why the other neighbor might have decided to close the gate, because they don't want to assume, besides that they don't want people ruining their grass, they also don't want to assume responsibility for any damages that might happen in their garden. Okay, so they happen not to have a pool, but if they did, right, it would be more dangerous, but anything really could cause a problem. So that's the big machloket we're going to see now between the two of them. Is that case of my neighbor making their backyard a public thoroughfare, but still having ownership on their items? Is that bor? Or is bor digging a pit in the middle of the street? So that's what we saw in this braitot. Okay, so we saw a chofer. Let's just start again from the Gemara there. Tanu Rabbanan, the braitot says, a chofer bor b'reshut yachid uptacho l'reshut harabim. Again, it's very confusing, the language, because they keep talking about one that's partly here and partly there, but that's not what's important. The important part is it opens into reshut harabim. Chayav and zehu bor hamor b'torah divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael says it's not the neighbor case. That's not bor. Bor is in the public domain, and her bor is owned by her. Yishmael says no. It's ownerless in the middle, right? If I dig a pit in the middle of the public domain, I don't have ownership over it, but I'm responsible for the damage it causes. Rabbi Akiva Omer, hifkir reshuto v'lo hifkir boro zehu bor hamor b'torah. My neighbor is the case of it. They said you can walk through my garden, but I still own the bor. That's a case of bor, because why? And he just assumes that this is part of all other nizikin. What is nizikin? My property damages, my shore damages, or my bor damages. It's my bor. I own it. So that's the machloket. The problem is that the Mishna matches neither of them, because the Mishna matches both of them. But if both of them say only this case, and this one says only this case, and we think they said only this case because it says zehu bor hamor b'torah. This is the case of bor. It sounds like this is the only case of bor. Then the Mishnah quotes both reshut harabim and reshut yachid. It doesn't fit according to anybody. So because of that, Raba and Rav Yosef each have to modify the machloket and say they actually both agree in one case and disagree about the other. Okay, it's really, and then we have to say, well, what did you mean then? This is the case. This is the case. Sounds like this is the only case. Well, either Rabbi Akiva is going to say, I actually agree about both cases, and Rabbi Shmuel says, no, it's only one, or it's the reverse. Rabbi Shmuel says, I agree in both cases. I think you're chayav in both cases, but Rabbi Akiva says only one, and we're going to go through this right now, if it wasn't clear exactly what I'm saying outside. Amarab. And here I'm going to pull up the study guide because this is helpful to use it to see. Okay, so we have here. Okay. So according to Rabbi Yishmael, remember, bor is b'reshut harabim, and Rabbi Akiva says bor is reshut yachid. So let's read it inside now. Rabbi says, b'bor b'reshut harabim kulei alma lo pligidim chayiv. He's now going to say, Rabbi Akiva actually doesn't say it's only reshut yachid. It's reshut yachid and reshut harabim. My time, but where does he get it from? Well, the pasuk says, okay, and this is going to be really, where does Rabbi Yishmael get it from? And Rabbi Akiva is going to agree with this drasha. Amar krakiv tach the pasuk is a little strange. The pasuk says, if you open a bor or if you dig a bor. Now, it's a little ridiculous to say that. If you dug a bor and I opened it and I'm liable, of course, if I dug the bor myself, I'd be liable. I did a lot worse by actually causing the bor to be created in the first place. So therefore, there's no reason to say both. And therefore, they say, why does it say both? To teach you the following thing. That means this is not like all other cases of damages or the case of shore, let's say, where I own something. This is not because I have ownership rights. what makes me liable, or not only, and that's Rabbi Akiva is going to say, not only ownership rights, but what makes me liable in this case is because I escaped kliya, because I was involved in causing a public stumbling block, causing a public hazard. Okay, so even Rabbi Akiva agrees with that. So if I dig a pit in the middle of the Reshut HaRabim and I don't put some boundary around it and signs up and warnings and all that, I'm liable. For sure, even Rabbi Akiva agrees with that. Lo nechleku ela bebor b'reshuto. The machloket is, okay, and here we're going to have Rabbi Yishmael has the purest opinion. Rabbi Yishmael says only Reshut HaRabim, nothing more. And Rabbi Akiva says it also includes a case of my neighbor's yard. Rabbi Akiva savar bor b'reshuto nami chayav. It's also responsible, not only, but also. How do we get this? Dichtiv Baal Habor. When it talks about who's responsible, it says Baal Habor Yishalem. Okay, in the case of bor, it says the owner, notice the words, the owner of the bor pays. So therefore comes Rabbi Akiva and says, obviously, bebor de'it le'balim Kamma Rachmana, right? The Torah was talking about a bor that has owners, okay? And therefore, yes, also if I'm an owner. Kiyif tak kiyif kret teaches you I'm liable for the action of opening a pit in the middle of the public domain, a cistern. And Baal Habor teaches me that I'm also responsible if I own it. What does Rabbi Yishmael do with this Baal Habor? He says you're not liable if you're an owner. Rabbi Yishmael savar Baal hatakala. This doesn't mean the owner of the bor, like I actually own the bor. It means the one responsible for the bor, the one responsible for putting an obstacle in the public domain. Elamai. Now, what do we have to explain according to this? And we're going to have to do the same in the reverse when we have Rav Yosef, who's going to do the flip, which is Elamai zehu bor hamor b'torah to come Rabbi Akiva. It sounded like Rabbi Akiva saying, this is the only case of bor, right? This is the case of bor, it says in the Torah. What he meant to say is, zehu bor shepatach bo hakatuv tchila letashlumin. This is bor that the Torah mentioned first when it talked about payment. And that's when it comes to the payment, the Torah said, Baal Habor. Okay? When it first, now notice the word payment, because we're going to get to Zehu Bor by Rabbi Yishmael, is not going to be bitashlumin, it's going to be in something else. Okay, we'll get to that soon. But right now we're going to say, this is Bor that it said in the Torah, this is the one that you are obligated for when it comes to payment. Okay, but it doesn't mean it's the only case. It's just, this is what the Torah mentioned when it talked about payment, it talked about ownership. That's it. Rav Yosef Amal, Bor b'reshut hayachid kol amalo pligidim chayiv. He's going to do the reverse. He's going to say, oh wait, Rabbi Yishmael of course agrees with Rabbi Akiva about a bor in a private domain. Okay, he thinks if I own the bor, of course I'm liable. He just adds that I'm also liable in Reshut HaRabim. And why does he obviously agree about that case? My time of Baal Habor Amar Rachmana bebor de'ilei bali maskina, because the Torah says the owner of the bor. Obviously, if the bor has an owner, of course the owner is going to be responsible. Again, it would have to be not that it's fully in their property, but that they opened up their property to the public and made it part of the public domain. Like my neighbor, let everybody walk through. Ki pligi, what's the machloket? Bebor b'reshut HaRabim. But bor b'reshut HaRabim is actually the machloket. If you dig a pit in the public domain and you have no more ownership rights to it anymore, Rabbi Akiva is going to say you're not liable, whereas Rabbi Yishmael is going to say you're also liable for that case. Rabbi Yishmael savar bor b'reshut HaRabim nami chayav dichtiv ki yiftach v'chi. Again, for the same reason that we saw before. He's going to say it's bor b'reshuto is in Reshut HaRabim is liable in the public domain because imam pticha chayav al kriyalo kol shekain, right? There's no reason to say also when you open a bor and also when you dug a bor. So why is it telling you that? And it's to teach you that not only if I'm the owner of the bor, but even if I just created a public hazard, even though it's not mine and I don't own it, I'm still going to be liable. For Rabbi Akiva, so what's Rabbi Akiva going to do with that drasha according to Rav Yosef? Now, according to Rabbi, he agreed with that drasha. But according to Rav Yosef, he doesn't agree with that drasha. What's he going to do with it? Hanu mitzrach tzricha. He needs it for a different drasha. He darshans something else from it. If it just said, when you open a bor, what would you have thought? Now, it says in the pasuk, v'lo yechasenu, and you didn't cover it. If you open a bor, or if you dig a bor and you didn't cover it, then you're liable. If you covered it, then you're not. So now, if it would have said ki yiftach, you would have thought, poteachu desagele bekisod. If let's say you dug a bor and I opened it. So then all I have to do is cover it. That's fine. But if I dug it, perhaps since I did more of an action here, right? Just to open it is not a real action. You're the one who dug the bor. maybe, right? So if I open it, all I have to do is close it and undo my action. But how would I undo my action if I dug it? The only way to undo it would be to fill it up with dirt. So maybe maybe I actually have to fill in the bore, and to cover it is not sufficient. Because, if I don't cover it, theoretically, someone else could, if I don't fill it in and I just cover it, maybe someone else will come and uncover it. So perhaps I need to undo my action entirely to not have any responsibility. And then I would have to fill it up with dirt. But, right, that's why the Torah told you, all you have to do is cover. And likewise, if you dug a bore, you would have said, then you would have said, well, I dug a bore, I have to cover it. And if not, I'll be liable. But I could say, maybe you would think, if I just opened a bore, let's say you dug the bore, you covered it, and I opened it. Maybe I didn't do any action really. Now I opened it, but that's not really an action. You're the one who dug it. Maybe I'm a kisoy nami lo bai. Maybe I don't have to cover it. Maybe it's not my responsibility because I didn't dig the bore. Kamash malan. That's why I need to tell you both kiftach and kiyakre, you're liable. And covering it is enough. I don't necessarily have to fill it in. That was the first part. Okay, so basically, he doesn't darshan that Reshut Rabim is liable because he has a different drasha on kiftach kiyachle. Ella, now we have to explain, if Rabbi Yishmael, according to this, thinks both cases are liable, then why did he say, Elamau zehu bor hamor b'torah? This is the case of bor the Torah mentions, to Kamma Rabbi Yishmael. So, because not the only case. Zehu sounds like this is the only case. Zehu bor, now it's going to be the parallel to the previous, shepatach bo achtuv tchila linizakin. This is where, when the Torah started talking about bor damages, this is where it started, with the kiftach kiyachre, which teaches you it's all about public domain. So that, right, one said this is where the Torah started, opened up when it talked about payment. He says this is where the Torah started up when it talked about damages. But it doesn't mean it's the only case. Okay, and that's how we explain them both. And again, you can look back at the chart to see it charted out. Now we're going to bring a difficulty on Rav Yosef. Again, it's easier to see it on the sheet, and we'll quickly review. Rav Yosef again says that Rabbi Yishmael holds also Reshut Rabim and also Reshut Yachid, and Rabbi Akiva holds only Reshut Yachid. Okay, so Rabbi Akiva doesn't hold Reshut Rabim at all, is a problem according to Rav Yosef. So now we're going to have a problem with this braitot, and I'll leave the chart open so you can see. I also added a few little things to help make it more clear. It's a little bit confusing, all these terms. Again, the confusing case, it's dug in the public domain, but it opens up into the private domain. Patur, you're exempt. Because why? Because it's Reshut Yachid. Now, this seems to imply Reshut Yachid is exempt. And right now, the Gemara assumes, even if I made my property open to everybody to traipse through, I'm still going to be exempt. Well, by the way, now they tell you can't do this for some other reason. Okay, already if we're talking about this, tunnel type pit where it starts in the public domain but the exit to it or the entrance to it is in the private domain, you can't dig under the Reshut Rabim because a lot of people walk in Reshut Rabim, and if you dig underneath, it could be eventually the floor will give way and people will, it will cause an obstacle down the road. But that's a separate thing. So you shouldn't do this kind of thing. But if you did it and it causes damage from people falling in from the private domain, you're not liable. And again, right now we're assuming even if you made your Reshut Hefker, okay, and you opened it to everybody. Okay, this case isn't going to interest us right now. I didn't even put it in the chart. But if you dig cisterns, pits, caves, all those things in or trenches in Reshut Yachid, and you opened it into the public domain, you're chayav. Okay, that's you're basically chayav because it's in Reshut Rabim. HaChofer borot bereshut Yachid asmucha lereshut Rabim, kigon elu hachofrim leushin patur. What is this? If you dig cisterns in the private domain, but which is right next to the public domain, you do it at the edge of your property. Why would you do this? Well, they give an example of people who dig to support the wall. In order to support their wall, they need to dig. And because their wall is obviously right up against the public domain, because you need to do this for your wall and you really have no choice. If you don't dig underneath there, you're going to have your wall's not going to be well supported. Then you're exempt. which seems to imply, okay, we'll get to it in a minute, but it seems to imply that if it's not for Ushin, you're going to be liable, which is going to say that Rishud Yachid, you're liable. This, by the way, seems to be a contradiction in the Reisha and the Seifa, because the Reisha said in the private domain you're exempt, and the Seifa said in the private domain you're liable. Again, it didn't say you're liable, it said you're not liable if you did it for Ushin. But that sounds like if you did it to just, for no good reason, you're going to be liable. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, who again, this opinion isn't going to interest us for the long term here for the sugya, but we're going to read it anyway. He disagrees with Tana Kamma about that issue and says, "Mechayev ad sheyaseh mechitza asara o ad sheyarchik mimkom drisat raglei adam mimkom drisat raglei behema arba'at tvachim." Some people say arba amot. He basically says this digging for Ushin maybe is allowed, but you got to put up some sort of barrier there, like those hazard signs, and you got to put a wall or keep it far away from the boundary, X amount of space, whether it's 4 tvachim, which is not a lot, of 4 amot, which is much more, but you can't do it right up against the boundary of the border because that's dangerous, because it's on the border of Rishud Rabbi. That's an aside. But the point is, the Tama de Leushin, halav Leushin chayav. So hamani, this braitot doesn't fit according to anybody. Why? Well, it depends. Bishlama l'Raba, but it's going to work for Rabbi. It's not going to work for Rav Yosef. Why? How can we explain this according to Rabbi? Well, according to Rabbi, we can simply say the first part of the braitot is Rabbi Yishmael, and the second part is Rabbi Akiva, because the first part says Rishud Yachid, you're exempt, which is Rabbi Yishmael, because he says only Rishud Rabim according to Rabbi. Okay, right? If you go back up to the top, only Rishud Rabim is going to be chayav according to Rabbi Yishmael. And Rabbi Akiva says also Rishud Yachid you're liable. So when it says leushin, you're going to be liable. If it's not leushin, it's not to support your wall, you're going to be liable, even though it's in the private domain, right? But it's near the public domain, which is kind of like there's, it's like it was like you were mafkir it because it's right next to the public domain and people could fall in. Well, then that makes sense. So Reisha Rabbi Yishmael, Sefer Rabbi Akiva. But Elele Rav Yosef, Bishlama Sefer Divrei Hakol. Okay, so according to Rav Yosef, remember, you keep having to go back to this, and that's why the chart's important, because you can always just look back. You have to remember everything in your head. According to Rav Yosef, everybody agrees about Rishud Yachid, right? Both Rabbi Yishmael says Rishud Yachid you're liable, and Rabbi Akiva. So the Sefer works according to both of them. Ela Reisha Mani, but the Reisha says you're exempt in the Rishud Yachid. Now, nobody holds that. According to Rabbi, we have Rabbi Yishmael who held that. But according to Rabbi Yosef, everybody agrees you're liable in Rishud Rabbi. So in Rishud Yachid, sorry. So how can we possibly explain this? Lo Rabbi Yishmael, velo Rabbi Akiva. Amar lecha Rav Yosef, what are you talking about? Kula divrei hakol. Actually, this whole thing works according to both. Why? Reisha shelo ifkir lo reshut tov velo boho. Why did you assume that we were talking about a case where you made your property ownerless? And it's in my private property, and I didn't say anyone can come through my property. Then I'm going to be exempt because I never allowed anyone to come in my property. And then that explains it. Took my kid tonight. Okay, now Rabbanami lo took my kid tonight. He says, you know what? If already you explain Rav Yosef, that you can explain this to be consistent with one person's opinion, I can now go back and explain Rabba also consists with one opinion, because Rabba was a little weak, because Rabba had to say the first part was Rabbi Yishmael, the second part was Rabbi Akiva. Comes Rav Acha and he says, I have a better way to explain it. Okay, first of all, you could explain the whole thing, Rabbi Akiva, actually, and that lo ifkir reshuto and ifkir, the way we explained it, but here's a different answer. Midareisha Rabbi Yishmael, sefanami Rabbi Yishmael. The whole thing is Rabbi Yishmael, and now how can we explain it? So the Reisha, Rishud Yachid is exempt, that's Rabbi. Rabbi says Rabbi Yishmael only obligates in the public domain. Now what about the Seifa? So why you're going to be liable? Now remember, what did we say? If it's Leushin, you're going to be exempt. But if it's not Leushin, you're going to be liable. Why would you be liable? Well, Tama de Leushin, halav Leushin chayav. But when would you be chayav? Ki gonda arvach aravuche le'reshut Rabbi. It would be a case where you dug down to support your wall, but you left this, ditch there, but you extended it in, right now we've been talking around the border. You extended it into the public domain. So then it would be basically a bore in the public domain. And then we can move that case, and it's not Rishud Yachid chayav, it's actually Rishud Rabim chayav. Okay, and then you would change that. So that's a way to explain Rabba according to one opinion. Meitive. Second question against Rav Yosef. We're going to do the same exact type thing. Bring a Reisha and a Seifa and say, Rav Yosef, this doesn't work for you. So here you have in a public domain, you're going to be liable. That's going to be Rabbi Yishmael across the board, right? And perhaps Rabbi Akiva, depending on who holds what. And but if you do it in your private domain, next to the public domain, patur. Well, that's Rabbi Yishmael across the board, very easily according to Rabbi, right? Because basically it's saying only in the public domain you're going to be liable, in the private domain you're going to be exempt. So Bishlam al Rabba kula Rabbi Yishmael, because he holds the purest opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, that Rabbi Yishmael only holds in the public domain you're liable. Elel Rav Yosef, but according to Rabbi Yosef, Bishlam Reisha Rabbi Yishmael. Ela Seifa Mani, but according to Rabbi Yosef, remember, Rabbi Yishmael holds you're liable also in Rishut Yachid. So this says you're exempt of Rishut Yachid. So Mani lo Rabbi Yishmael, lo Rabbi Akiva. To which the answer, wait. If you dig in your house next to Rishut Rabbi, even though generally when you open your property and say, oh, you can come through my property, but keep ownership over the bore, you're usually liable. But in this case, because you were doing it to build your wall, we're going to allow you because you have no choice, basically. This is the way they supported their walls. So if you didn't do this, your wall wouldn't stand up, and therefore we're going to permit you to do it. Okay, so it's an exception to the rule because you did it leushin. Now, notice it didn't say leushin there, but you would have to just say the braitot must be talking about leushin, otherwise it doesn't make sense according to Rav Yosef. So this was two questions against Rav Yosef. We resolved it. Tanu Rabbanan. Chafaru patachu masar l'rabim patur. Let's say you dig a pit, a cistern. Now, what were cisterns meant for? For drinking water. So if you dug a cistern in the public domain for people to get drinking water from, and you basically said, I'm giving rights of this to the public so everyone can drink from this, well, then you're exempt because you no longer have responsibility for this bore. Right? Otherwise, no one would ever dig cisterns in Rishut Rabim. If we're always going to make them responsible for damages that happen, no one would ever do it. So what it exactly means to give it over to the public, how that works, that's a whole debate among the Rishonim. We're not going to get into that, but it's interesting in and of itself. But if you dug and you opened it and you didn't give it to the public, then obviously chayav. Now we're going to hear. You might remember we came across them and we're going to see why. You'll remember this hopefully soon. We saw it in Yavamot and in, where was it? In Shkalim. Okay? Nehunia was a guy, and you'll see why he came up in Shkalim, because he used to dig borot shechinu ma'arot, shaya. Well, okay, he would dig them for the Olei Regalim. Remember, Shkalim was all about all the people coming on Aliyah Regel to the temple. He would build them so the people, when they were on their way to the temple, would have water to drink. Shaya chofer potech u'moser l'rabim, and he would do exactly that. He would dig them, open them, and then turn them over to the public. So he was no longer responsible for damages. When he did this, the rabbi said, oh, wow, he fulfilled this halacha. Now, the way they understand it right now is he fulfilled this halacha and this and no other halacha. So the Gemara says, halachazo over too low. Wait, this is the only halacha he kept and no other one? No, el-ema af halachazo. No, what they meant to say was even this halacha he kept. Now, Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're going to get to a whole theological discussion. His daughter fell into a big cistern. Wow. Okay, here he was. He dedicated his life to helping the public with public cisterns, and his daughter falls into one of them. Now, we just said he's not really reliable, right? And here his daughter falls into the cistern. Bava with Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. Remember, he's the miracle man. So they come and they tell Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. This is the story that we already learned. Sha'ari shona marlem shalom. The first hour he said, no, he wasn't there, but he said, I know she's okay. Right? She didn't die from falling in. Shniya amar lahem shalom. Second, he says, yes, she's okay. Shlishi, third hour, amar lahem altai. He says, I know she got out already. Well, they go to find her and they see she's out of the bore. How'd you get out? Who helped you? And there was a male, I don't remember, a Rachel, a sheep or something, or a ram. Right, it was a ram that was there, and there was an elderly man taking the ram. Some people say this is a reference to Akedah Yitzchak with the ram and the elderly man, and that it was sort of this reference that, oh, the Akedah saved her. Which is interesting because it's all about sacrificing, right? He sacrificed his child by helping the public, right? But he ended up having to sacrifice his child because his child fell into the pit. So anyway, that's an interesting thing to think about. But in any case, what happens here? So then they go back to Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa and they say, how did you know she got out of the pit? Naviata? Are you a prophet? Amar lahem, right? Can you imagine? Right? They don't have prophets in their days. They're like, this guy must be a prophet. Amar lahem lo navi anochi velo ben navi anochi. I'm not a prophet. I'm not the son of a prophet. Ela kach amarti. It was simple logic. I said, or theology. Tavarsha utot tzadik miste'er bo yikashel bo zaro. Something that he worked very hard to help others with. His daughter was going to get punished by that and fall into that. Can't possibly be. It must be she'll be saved. Okay, so that sounds very nice. And then we say, okay, well, if he worked hard on this, your child's not going to die from such a, something you worked so hard to do. Amar Rabbi Acha. Rabbi Acha says not so simple, because look at the end of the story. His son died from thirst. And according to Rav Acha, this is all because those who were close to God, nisara ma'od, this is a very famous line. Those who were particularly close to God, God is careful with them like hair, right? Like a hair. In other words, the thinness of a hair, God is so super careful of any little thing that they do, and they get punished for it. Okay, God is exacting with with the ones who are the most righteous. So that theoretically, now this raises a whole other question, which is very complicated, particularly these days, which is what are children going to get punished for their, right? According to this, the child got killed because of the father's sin. And that seems right. We don't know what his father did wrong, but they're saying, the righteous person is Nehunia ben haKane, because that's what they were talking about. How could he have done something and then his son dies through it? And remember, thirst is he was trying to help everybody with their thirst issue by giving them water, and then the son dies of thirst. So it's very complicated sugya and how to take this. Rabbini Yafit Clymer, on second thought, is finally starting up again in English. And Be'ezrat Hashem, I hope by Sunday we'll have the English. She's teaching this week specifically on this topic. And in flashback today, Shuli Mishkin wrote all about this topic of Nehunia ben haKane. And so you can look there. So Rabbi Nehunia, and really it should be Rabbi Hanina. It's a mistake, it seems. It's not Nehunia ben haKane, wasn't a rabbi. This seems to be Rabbi Hanina saying, that's how it appears in Yavamot. Mehacha is a different pasuk that teaches you, not Svivav nisara ma'ov from the Lashon of Se'al, the hair, and Svivav are the people close to him, but he learns it from a different pasuk, El na'arat besog shoshim rabah, v'nora al kol Svivav. Right, God is admired within the congregation of all his holy ones, which is really a reference to the angels. And Nora al kol Svivav, and he is mighty and puts his fear in all those who are close to him. Those are the righteous people. Therefore, fear of him because he's very exacting with them. Amar Rabbi Chanina, Kol Omer Kadosh Baruch Hu Vatran, Vatranu Yivatru Chayav. Anyone who thinks that God just lets things go and I sin, God's not going to punish me for it, you're wrong, and so wrong that Yivatru Chayav. You think God gives up and just says, let it go. You're basically giving up on your life. That's a very strong statement. Because all the ways of God are just, which sounds like God punishes for everything. What happened to Midat HaRachamim, and God is right. So again, there's Midat HaRachamim we're going to talk about in a minute. What does it mean when it says Erech HaPayim? That God is slow to anger, but it should say anger is af, not a payim. Why is it plural? Okay, there's different ways of understanding this. I'll just go, because we don't have a lot of time, in one direction, which is both for tzadikim and for Risha'im, he's slow to punish, to allow people to do tshuva. In other words, while there is midat hadin, and if you do something wrong, God will punish you, but God gives you an opportunity to repent. And if you repent, then there's room for you. So then God can change his mind and not be exacting. So it's obviously, this is a big question, how does this all work? Obviously, none of us all know how this exactly works, right? These are theories about how theological statements about how we think what are God's ways. But we're going to leave it at that because we have more to do today. Tanu Rabbanit. Lo yisakel adam mireshuto lereshut harabim. The sakel means, skila is stoning, but here we mean taking out stones. If you take stone, normally if you have land you want to plant, so you have to get rid of all the stones in the field. So don't take your stones from your domain and put it into the public domain. But in fact, it was a maaseh ba'adam achad shaya mesakel mereshuto lereshut harabim. He basically kept taking the stones out and stuck them in the public domain. That's basically a hazard, like bore. And a chassid saw him, a righteous person, and said, a pious man, and said to him, Reika, you empty person. And here he says the following kind of riddle. Pay attention. Why are you taking things from a domain that's not yours? What do you mean? That was his domain. He was taking it from his house. But he says, why are you taking it from a domain that's not yours? You're putting it in a domain that is yours. Now, what was the chassid telling him? The chassid is telling him, you think it's your domain and you're getting rid of them and putting them in the public domain, which is not your domain. But it's actually the opposite. Because one day you're going to sell your property. It's not going to be yours anymore. And what's going to be yours? Always, the public domain is always yours. And in fact, let's see what happens. So, the guy mocked him because he said, what a ridiculous statement. I'm moving it from my property to a property that's not mine. Why are you telling me I'm moving it from a property that's not mine to a property that is mine? So, liyamim, time passed, nitzrach limkor sadeh, he had to sell his field. He had no money, he had to sell his field. V'hayam halech b'oto reshut harabim, and he was walking in the public domain. V'nichshal b'otam avanim, and he tripped over those exact stones, right? Classic Talmudic story, everything comes back to you. Amal yafeh amar li oto chasim mipnei ma atam mesakel mereshut she'eno shalcha l'reshut shalcha, and then finally he understood what that chassid was saying about that eventually the reshut harabim became his because he didn't even have a place to live and his property was no longer his own, and he obviously caused his own, damage. Okay, moving now to the next Mishna. HaChofer, continuing with bor. HaChofer bor b'reshut harabim v'nafal l'tocho shor chamor chayav. This is the classic what the pasuk says. You dig a pit, public domain, a shor chamor falls in, you're chayav. Oh, by the way, I just didn't really come back to this, but the previous Mishnah, which talked about reshut yachid and reshut harabim, in the end, either Rabbi or Rav Yosef, it's going to fit with either Rabbi Yishmael or Rabbi Akiva, because again, each one included, depending on who you held by, one of them includes both cases of reshut harabim and reshut yachid. So that was again why Rabbi and Rav Yosef had to come in order to explain that previous Mishnah. This one assumes reshut harabim you're liable for, just like the previous one did. Okay, whether it's a bore, whether it's a shiach, a ditch, a ma'ara, a cave, charitzin, a trench, and nitzim is like a cone-shaped ditch, you're liable. Imken, lama ne'amar bor. Okay, even though it's all those things, why did the Torah specifically say bor? Ma bor sheyesh bo k'dei lamid asarat tefachim, af kol sheyesh bo k'dei lamid asarat tefachim. Wanted you to know that just like bor, 10 tefachim deep is the depth that could kill someone, also in all these other things. We're going to go through in the Gemara what the difference between all these things. If it was less than 10 tefachim and a father to shor chamor v'meit patur. If it was less than 10 tefachim and a shor chamor falls in and dies, you'd be exempt. But you would be liable for damages, because remember, this is a big thing we're going to see going forward. Anything less than 10 tefachim can only damage. We don't assume it's going to kill. 10 tefachim, it already can kill. So if someone dies in less than 10 tefachim, you're not liable for their death because you dug something that couldn't really kill someone for whatever reason. They died, but it's not your fault. But you are liable for damages at less than 10. Amarav. Here we get to another big basic machloket. We had the Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yishmael. Now we're going to get to a big machloket of Rav and Shmuel. A bore, the Torah made you liable for the bore, not because of the impact. Normally you think, what's going to kill you? The smack on the ground. Why? And I'll explain in a minute what hevel is. We didn't get there yet, but I'm just going to keep reading. Alma kasavar chavata karka olam hu damazkele. And we saw this before when the guy slipped in the water and got his clothes dirty or fell and hurt himself. And we said, it's the ground that killed the person. And the ground is same thing. The ground at the bottom of the pit is what hurts you from the impact. It's true you dug it and caused the impact to kill, but Rav says, no, that's from the impact of the ground. It's the ground that injured you. I'm not liable if the ground is what hit you because I don't own the ground. What's the problem with a bore? It's the hevel. It's the fumes. There's lethal fumes in this bore that could kill you because a bore is right underground and there's lethal fumes in there. Right? It's suffocating. He says it's the hevel. Shmuel amar lehevlo v'kol sheken lechavto. He says, yeah, it's true the hevel could kill you. You're liable for that, but all the more so you're liable for the impact. Of course, you fell down and hurt yourself on the ground, and the ground is there because you dug the pit, and or someone else dug the pit, and therefore, obviously, it's the chavata also. Now, why didn't Shmuel just say it's only the impact and not the hevel? He said because the Torah said bore, it could be, let's say you put soft things in the bottom of the bore, and the landing was very soft, but you died because of the hevel. Well, Shmuel thinks it's both. My benayu, what's the difference between the two of them? Right? Either way, a boar of 10 tefachim could kill someone, whether the hevel, whether the chavata. So he says, no. Well, what if you made a big hill, a big mound in Rosh Hashanah that was 10 tefachim high, and someone fell from on top of there? So l'Rava gova l'machayev, l'Shmuel gova nami machayev. If Shmuel, it's all about the impact is what killed you, so you'll be responsible. And that is, again, if you died from it, I would be responsible if I built that mound. Rav says, no, there's no hevel there. It was in open air. Not going to be liable. My Talmud Rav, where does he get this from? To Amar Krav v'nafal. Actually, Paul derech nefila. What's the normal way of falling? Not climbing up to something and then falling off of it. The normal way of falling is just falling into something. And that wouldn't be something that was of height. If you have to go up it and then fall, I'm not liable for that. The owner of whoever built it. Ushum l'Shmuel nafal kodu mashmi. He says falling from height, falling into depth. Either which way it's falling. Now we're going to have a difficulty on Rav. Tnan. Im ken lama ne'amar bor. Our Mishna says, if so, why does it say bor if all these other things are liable as well? Ma bor sheyesh bo kedei la'amid 10 tvachim, af kol sheyesh bo kedei la'amid 10 tvachim. Right? That's why it said bor to teach you the 10 tvachim. So what does that have to do with Rav and Shmuel? Well, Bishlam ad Shmuel, af kol, the words af kol seems to say, well, it said more to include even more things that we already mentioned in this Mishnah. Now, according to Shmuel, what's more? Height, right? If you build something up. So af kol atuye gova. But l'Rav, the af kol atuye mai. All the cases are already mentioned in the Mishnah. You wouldn't need this bor is coming to include even more cases. There aren't any more cases. We discussed them all in the Mishnah. La'atuye charitzim unitzim. You want to say that? It already says those in the Mishnah. To which the Mishnah says, no. When the Mishnah said, why did it say bor then? And it's to include all these other cases, meaning to include all the other cases we already mentioned in the Mishnah. It's not coming to include anything additional. The Gemara said, the Mishnah had said, if you have all these other things, why does it say bor? So you know about all those other things. Okay, in other words, it defines what's unique about a bor, and then we can apply it to all those other things. But the things we mentioned, it doesn't have to include anything additional. Okay, so that worked. The first question on Rav worked. We're going to have another question on Rav soon, but now we're going to get off a bit on a tangent, which is, Hani kuli de katane lamali. So why did the Mishnah have to list all of those separately? Tzricha. Now we're going to see all the differences between them. Each one's going to have a different shape and different unique features. A bor is constricted and round. So you might think that's where there's hevel, because we're all in Rav right now. But a ditch that's long, it's rectangular in shape, maybe you would say because of its length, it doesn't have hevel, doesn't have those fumes that could kill. But the Mishnah says it does. You might say a shiach at the depth of 10 because it's narrow, it's a problem. A cave is more square shaped, so it's not as narrow on one side, even though the ditch was long, but it was narrow. Maybe maybe at 10 deep and 10 wide, maybe it's not, maybe it doesn't have hevel. It doesn't have to be 10 wide. It depends, however wide, but it's square shape. Maybe in square shape, the hevel goes out. A cave is usually covered. So if a cave is covered, therefore, we're going to say, right, because it has an opening on the side, but not at the top. So if a cave is covered, you might say maybe that's why the hevel stays in, right? The fumes don't get out very easily. Aval charitzin, which is basically a charitz, is going to be the same shape as the cave, but open at the top. Because it's square shaped more, the air might get out. So that's why they had to tell you no. Also there, at 10 deep, it's going to kill. From the fumes. Because it's no wider at the top than it is at the bottom. But ni'itzim, which we said are cone-shaped, where they're wider at the top, maybe the hevel goes out, right? They're wider at the top than they are at the bottom. Maybe you would think at 10 there's no hevel. Well, Kamma shmalan. That's why each case is coming to teach you. You might not have thought it had hevel that could kill, but it does. Okay. Question on Rav, another question. Tnan. Also from our Mishnah. Now at 10 deep, it could kill, but it could damage. It could kill. Less than that, it could only cause damage. Right? So nafal l'tocho shor chamor v'mei patul. my time, Allah mishum delay bechavata. Now, it sounds like the difference between 9 and 10 must be because of the impact. Lo, mishum delay behavla. They said, what do you mean? No, it's because it doesn't have enough hevel at 10 deep. What does that have to do with Rav, right? It doesn't prove Shmuel over Rav. Then they say, but I don't get it. If you're saying less than 9, it doesn't have lethal fumes, then why are you liable for damages? To which they say, no, Amri, there's lethal fumes that could damage less than 10, at less than 10. And only at 10 can the lethal fumes actually kill. Okay, maybe they're not lethal fumes, then they're fumes and not lethal. They become lethal at 10. So maybe it's a little weaker, but you can explain that according to Rav as well, right? The simple is the depth is what causes you more impact. But again, the depth could cause more hevel, obviously, also. So 2 questions against what we've resolved them. Now we're going to start with Rav Nachman, and we'll see more of this tomorrow. We get a story. An ox falls into a water channel. Now, a water channel in Hebrew is called an amat mayim, and here's just something cute. Rashi says, why is it called an amat mayim? Because it's an amma deep, and that's the important part for our story. It was an amma deep. What's an amma? It's a cubit, which is 6 tfachim. Now, we've been talking about 10 tfachim kills. Now, here we're going to see this animal fell into a ditch that was this water channel that was 6 tfachim deep. Now, this has nothing to do with damages, okay? We're not going to talk about damages, but you're going to see something right away that's going to contradict. Shachte mari. Now, after the animal fell in, didn't die, the owner takes it out, slaughters the animal, and wants to go eat it. Tarfe, Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman said, what are you talking about? This animal's a treifa. It got crushed in that fall. It was going to die, and any animal that's going to die, you can't shecht. It's called a treifa. Amar Rav Nachman, Ishaka mari the high Torah kabbat the kimcha, ba'azal tana be'midrasha. If you had been smart, you would have taken a kav, which is a measurement of wheat. Basically, what he's saying is, make yourself some bread for the way, walk to the local Beit Midrash, go ask a question, can I shech this animal or not? And you would have saved yourself this big loss, because now you have a whole loss and your animal's dead and you can't eat it. But they would have told you, Im sha'atame leik shera, wait 24 hours, see if the animal lives. If the animal lives, it's obviously not going to die from this fall. But since you didn't, we have to assume, right? And then lo afsidei Torah the shava Kamma kabe. And then you wouldn't have lost this shore, which is worth a lot of kabim. You should have spent 1 kav to get yourself, right, to save this animal instead of losing a ton of kabim. Maybe he's saying like you were, what, you're so starving, just eat some bread in the meantime until you get an answer about your animal. Because then again, you lost your whole animal. Now here comes the big problem. And I'll leave you with this. This implies that Rav Nachman holds that you can die from a less than 10 fall. This was only 6 tfachim, and he assumed that the animal could have died. All so much so that he caused and said this animal's a treifa and you can't eat the meat. So if we say you're only liable for damages and for death, if it falls 10 tfachim, because less than 10 tfachim is not going to kill, how could Rav Nachman possibly say this? So we're going to bring 3 questions Rav is going to raise on Rav Nachman. The first one is our Mishna, this issue. Our Mishna seems 10 tfachim, and then we're going to see some other questions. So just as a very brief summary for today, our main topics we dealt with were Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Akiva, and the 2 different interpretations, Raba and Rav Yosef, of which case do they agree about which is the case of Shiur in the Torah, where you mafkired it, you said, oh, you can walk through my property, but I still own the boar, or is it a case where you did it in the public domain? And only that case, or both cases, right? We saw the different opinions. We brought 2 questions against Rav Yosef, and then we resolved them. Then we just talked about making it public. You could do it in a way that you wouldn't be responsible, like Nehunia ben haKane. We saw about his daughter. We got off in this theological issue. Then we got into this 10 tfachim deep kills, less than that damages, and that it's not just a boar, it's all these other things. We basically brought a brachlok at Rav and Shmuel about, is it the hevel, the fumes, the dangerous fumes that kill you, or damage, or is it the impact or the fumes as well, right? It could be the impact, it could be the fumes. So we have this big machloket, and then we brought 2 questions on Rav, and we resolved them. And through the first one, we got into a whole thing of why each case in the Mishna was mentioned and what that added that we wouldn't have known otherwise. And now we get to this big problem with Rav Nachman, who seems to say all of a sudden that less than 6 could kill. And then how does that work with our Mishna and some other sources that seem to imply that more than 10, that you need 10 to kill, that the depth of less than 10 is really not going to kill? Then it doesn't make sense. How did Rav Nachman make this a treifa? That's for tomorrow. Wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom, a good fast, and good news for this weekend.